We have shocking new details in the case of the former first-round NFL draft pick, now an accused killer. For the first time, a courtroom heard what Darron Lee told police when they arrived at his home after he allegedly killed his girlfriend, claiming he had no idea what happened. But then came the bombshell. What prosecutors say he asked ChatGPT after the murder and before he called 911. We're on the case presented by Law&Crime. I'm Stewart. Hey guys, real quick, I want to tell you about this app that you're going to love. It's called Upside and it gets you cash back. Yes, extra cash back on everyday purchases like gas, groceries, and takeout. So here's what you do. Download Upside. It's free. You can claim an offer at one of their 100,000 plus locations and pay like you typically would with your card. Then you verify the purchase and then you get money back. Now, say you need gas, maybe you want takeout one night. What I do, I search for offers on Upside, and then after I spend, money appears in my app and I can transfer it straight to my bank. Upside's frequent users earn an average of $254 back a year. So to start getting your cash back, click the link in the description or scan the QR code and use promo code OTC to get an extra 25 cents bonus on every gallon on your first tank of gas. When the New York Jets selected Darron Lee in the first round of the 2016 NFL draft, he signed a deal that was for 4 years and it was worth roughly $10 million. But this is Lee now. After one of his recent court appearances, this video per WBNS television, he's shackled, he's in a jail jumpsuit, and he is currently being held without bond. Lee is accused of killing his fiancée on February 5th inside their home near Chattanooga, Tennessee. Her name was Gabriella Perpetuo. She was just 29 years old. Her obituary shows pictures of her working as a nurse and spending time with family and friends. Her family has filed a civil wrongful death lawsuit against Lee, seeking $50 million. And that lawsuit is shedding some light on what they believe happened inside the home where she lost her life. Now, before we talk about that lawsuit, I need to break down what we just learned about what Lee reportedly said to law enforcement on that day in February that they responded to his home.
CPR in progress, Snow Cone Way, off Snowy Owl. I'm a 29-year-old female.
This is a picture of the body cam footage that was played at Lee's preliminary hearing in Hamilton County, Tennessee, per WTVC television. Now, you can see in this picture, Lee is speaking to a first responder, still wearing some NFL gear on his front patio. Now, Lee was the one who called 911, and he told law enforcement he had no idea what happened to Gabriella. Prosecutors played roughly 10 minutes of the body cam video in court. And according to WTVC, Lee is heard on that body camera saying, quote, "She wasn't saying anything. And that's when I called 911 immediately. And I was like, what's going on?" But then prosecutors unveiled what they say are dozens of messages that Lee had sent to ChatGPT. And they argue those messages are proof that he knew exactly what happened to Gabriella and that he is allegedly the one who did it. Now, before we get to the ChatGPT part of this, we need to talk about the fall from grace that Darron Lee has had. Frankly, saying fall from grace, it's an understatement considering everything that this guy had going for him for most of his life. Lee was a standout college athlete, played linebacker at Ohio State, and in 2015, he was the defensive MVP of the Sugar Bowl when the Buckeyes beat Alabama. He had 7 tackles in that game, 3 for a loss, and 2 sacks. Now, even if you don't know football, those are monster numbers. And that game, it's one of the great games the Buckeyes have played in the last 20 years because they went on to win the national championship that year. And then in the spring, Lee cashed in big time financially because he signed a contract for more money than most people see in a lifetime. He was the 20th overall pick in the NFL draft by the New York Jets. So Lee goes and plays in the biggest media market. He's a millionaire, but the pros did not go as well as his college career did. He only lasted a couple years in New York. Some might label him a bust. He did bounce around for a few more years, including a stint with the Chiefs in 2019, where he actually won a Super Bowl. He also played for the Raiders and the Bills. Now, even though he didn't go on to have a Hall of Fame NFL career, let's be honest, from a financial standpoint, he should be in a good place. He made more than $10 million. His last season, though, was in 2021, and attorneys for Gabriella's family have reportedly said that Lee hasn't worked for the past 5 years. Now, even though he may have been comfortable from a financial standpoint, Lee is also someone who has had issues with the law and issues with domestic violence long before this murder case. For example, in 2023, he was arrested in Franklin County, Ohio on a charge of domestic violence knowingly causing physical harm. He eventually pleaded guilty to an assault charge in that case, and a no contact order was issued. And in that case, according to local media reports, Lee was accused of punching a woman in the face multiple times. Now, at this most recent hearing this week in Tennessee, where he is facing this murder charge, prosecutors reportedly said that Lee is actually on probation as we speak, related to a case out of Florida where he was charged with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. So now you know a little bit more about him. You can see he is someone who certainly had every opportunity, but at the same time has a troubled past when it comes to domestic violence in the legal system. With all that said, let's go to February 5th and what prosecutors say happened to Gabriella inside this home in Hamilton County, Tennessee. Now, when law enforcement arrived, it was around 1:30 in the afternoon. Law enforcement say that they spoke with Lee, and he told them, reportedly, he had no idea what happened to Gabriella, even though she had some very significant injuries that we're going to talk about in just a moment. And it's also important to note that he said that he called 911 immediately. Prosecutors later say that he did shed some light on what potentially happened to Gabriella, claiming that she fell through a glass shower door. But police say that Lee also sent those messages to ChatGPT a full day before law enforcement were even called. And that could be incredibly damning for Lee as this case plays out. Now, prosecutors say, according to WTVC television, that there was blood in multiple rooms of this house. Now, these are pictures of the crime scene shown in court. In the blue you see there is where law enforcement say blood was found on the floor, on the walls. Court documents show that Gabriella had multiple stab wounds and bruising on her head and her eyes. Blood was found on the toilet in several rooms. Blood was found in Lee's BMW. Blood was found in the kitchen, allegedly. So let's get to these ChatGPT messages, because you can see here, just based off of the forensic evidence that prosecutors say they have, Lee's story of allegedly falling through a glass shower door, that doesn't seem to add up at this point. And then there's what he did the day before on ChatGPT that the prosecution presented this week. Now, prosecutors argue that Lee used the chatbot as a legal advisor to allegedly cover up a crime scene and to know what to say to law enforcement. One of those messages reportedly read, quote, "Don't know what to do right now. Fiance did her crazy thing again, and now she's messed up. I wake up and she has 2 swollen eyes. I didn't do anything, self-inflicted. She stabbed herself, slit her eye, IDK, but she isn't waking up or responding. What do I do?" Now, even though as you read that, Lee is trying to argue that Gabriella did these injuries to herself, it's important to remember that he sent this, according to prosecutors, a full day before he called 911. Now, prosecutors say that ChatGPT actually responded by reportedly saying, quote, "Here's what to say without framing it as police trouble." Now, Lee is facing a charge of first-degree murder. He is being held without bond in Tennessee. Gabriella's family filed a $50 million wrongful death lawsuit against Lee, and that suit reads that Gabriella sustained, quote, "severe bodily injuries, including but not limited to blunt force trauma to the head, resulting in severe brain injury, a fractured cervical spine/neck, multiple puncture and stab wound to the chest, abdomen, and leg, extensive abrasions and bruising to the left side of her face, and human bite marks found on the descendant's body, consistent with a violent physical struggle and intentional assault." The judge, after this probable cause hearing, found that there is probable cause for this case to move forward, and it is now reportedly headed to a grand jury. Joining us now to talk more about this case and where it could go from here is Rich Schoenstein, trial attorney. Thank you, as always, for being with us here on Law and Crime. You know, ChatGPT is a new tool for a lot of people. I know we often talk about text messages in cases like this, but you're actually seeing, according to prosecutors, a defendant having reached out to ChatGPT asking what to do in this situation. What did you make of that development in this case?
Well, it's interesting. We've seen now for a number of years critical evidence in electronic form. And in a lot of these cases, we hear about text messaging, we hear about emails, and we hear about internet searches because we have cases where suspects, searched on the internet how to clean up after a dead body, right? Or something like that. And so this to me is just that, but with the new technology. He didn't allegedly do an internet search. He allegedly asked ChatGPT a question.
And you look at it too, and it's, what he searched, from what we understand, it's not where he admitted guilt, but then similarly to text messages and some of the other data you can get from a phone or a computer, he was asking these questions a day before he calls 911. When you look at how strong the evidence may be against him in this case, just that fact alone, even if he's not, it's not the forensic evidence part of it, but just there's clearly something amiss with the timeline he was giving law enforcement and what ChatGPT is saying. What do you make of that part of it as prosecutors are building their case against Darron Lee?
Well, I think it's very helpful for the prosecution. It first of all, it contradicts directly the story that he told the authorities when they came. It shakes up the timeline, and it contradicts what he told law enforcement. So that's a problem. And it shows planning, and it shows potential consciousness of guilt. It is very damning evidence, is what it is. The rest of the evidence has to come in. Prosecutors have to present their entire case, but asking AI questions about this is a bad look for sure.
Without a doubt. And this is not his first run-in with the legal system. He was facing domestic violence charges in Ohio in 2023. Prosecutors say that he was still on probation for another assault case out of Florida. He had an incident in New York in 2017 when he was on the Jets. So this is someone who has faced allegations and also has pleaded guilty to domestic violence in the past. How much of that could be brought in if this goes to trial? As if prosecutors want to paint him as someone who has been violent in the past, there is evidence on the record, and he has pleaded guilty to it, of assaulting a woman in previous cases.
Well, that will set up a classic battle of prior bad acts where the prosecutors want to put in similar conduct or related conduct that allegedly happened previously. And the defense will argue that that's not admissible because it's very prejudicial at trial and it's not probative of the question of whether he killed this particular person on this particular date. None of those other incidents were him killing somebody. It doesn't go to showing an MO. It's merely intended to show that he had violent tendencies, which I think the defense will contend is not a sufficient reason to put it into evidence. So we're going to have to get into more details about what exactly those acts were, what the circumstances were, what the status of any allegations were in those situations. But that's going to be a pretrial evidentiary battle if this case goes to trial.
You talk about some of the battle with the evidence. I mean, on the ChatGPT front of it, that seems like if a jury hears that and they read the messages that were shown in this probable cause hearing, that could be, very, very bad for Darron Lee and his defense. What can a defense attorney do with something like ChatGPT to try to get that excluded in a way that we do see sometimes? Maybe it's a text message, maybe it's an internet search that a defense attorney tries to get out of the way. How difficult is it to actually get that thrown out in cases like this?
I don't really see a path to getting that evidence thrown out. That is the defendant's communication about the circumstances of this person's death on a computer. I don't think that evidence is coming out. It's not privileged. It's not protected in any way that I can think about, as long as they can establish, I guess they have to establish authenticity. They have to prove that they've pulled this off of a computer and it really is him, and they can show that it really was him. That would be the challenge. But if they can get over that hurdle with a computer expert, which I assume they can, then I don't see any way to keep that evidence out.
Look at Darron Lee. He played linebacker. That can be like a car crash, whether it's college or the pros, multiple times a game over and over. The public is well aware of what CTE is. I don't think that's been brought in at this point, but I could see the defense maybe bringing that argument up if they can prove it. I mean, to present a medical condition, if the evidence is that damning and that's maybe not a whodunit type case, I guess what's the path forward if they believe that that's something that can be presented, that they would have to go through, that a jury could actually hear that?
Well, you're talking now about like an insanity defense, and state laws vary on that. But to sort of cut to the core of it, the insanity defense is that they have a mental defect that precludes them from knowing really right from wrong, or for knowing that the actions they were taking were wrongful. My understanding is, I guess CBT could lead to that in certain circumstances, but again, you would need very good expert testimony to get to that stage, to be able to make a proffer evidentiary of that the court would allow you to put that defense in front of the jury. I haven't heard that they're going to do that. I think so far the defense is not conceding that he is the person that did this crime or that it was a crime. Right? I mean, his story is that she somehow inflicted it herself, or this just happened. So you have to get over that hump and then have the defense say, we're going to put on this insanity defense. And then I don't know if they would have enough to support that in this case.
And I do know that CTE, you can't really prove someone has it until they've passed away and their brain can be examined. When it comes to just him as a figure, this is someone who had every opportunity in the world. I think the public could look and see he was, his first contract was 4 years for $10 million. That's more money than most people see in a lifetime. In some of these cases, when there is strong evidence facing a defendant, how much does the story of the person and maybe even building up some sort of sympathetic figure in a defendant actually matter when it comes to murder cases like this?
Well, I think if you're on the defense, you want to do some of that if this case goes to trial, because he's a professional football player. So the assumption by the jury is going to be that he has violent tendencies, because football is a game of violence, right? I don't mean that disparagingly. I watch football. Sometimes I sort of grit my teeth and say, should I really be watching this? But I do, right? It is a game of violence, and the people who play it, and he played linebacker, that is somebody who hits people for a living violently and tries to put them to the ground. So telling a more complicated story about his background, his upbringing, trying to establish his person would be a good move by the defense to try to bolster his case.
And of course, he is just accused of this terrible murder. The defense has not given up that he is the one who did this. As we were saying, his side of the story is that he woke up, he doesn't really know what happened, and she was just in this condition. On the other hand, you have the prosecution. They have not said whether or not they're going to go for the death penalty in this case, but Tennessee's a death penalty state. Like, at this point, long away from a potential trial, what type of jockeying is happening behind the scenes between the defense and the prosecution, where I could see the prosecution, they certainly have leverage of saying, well, the death penalty is a card that they have, but then at the same end, you have the defense still arguing potentially that he's not the person who did this.
Yeah, I would gather there would have to be some kind of negotiation at some point. I mean, this does seem to me like a case where the prosecution might take death off the table if they can get a guilty plea. It is a sort of in the crime of passion category, although there's an argument that he has violent tendencies, but this is not, it's hard to get to the death penalty in a single victim case like this, especially when the the defendant knows the victim. I mean, there are still people on juries in this country who really don't think it's a crime to hit your wife. I mean, that's just, unfortunately, I think, a fact that you have to consider when you're prosecuting these cases. So I would think they would have some sort of negotiation about it. But if he is claiming, if he is glued to this argument that he's not the guy, that he didn't do it at all, I don't know how far that negotiation gets.
When it comes to the civil side of this, Gabriella Perpetuo's family, they have filed a $50 million wrongful death lawsuit. I don't know what Darron Lee's financial situation is. He hasn't played in 5 years, certainly made a lot of money in the pros. In these types of cases where the criminal side of it hasn't played out yet, how do you, as an attorney, kind of quantify what the wrongful death number is that a family is going for in cases like this?
Well, I'm not surprised to see a $50 million number on it. It's the death of a young person, arguably violently. And obviously, you have a potentially wealthy defendant. And I don't know any better than you do about what his wealth is. My understanding is these football players have a long line of people who are getting paid out of their salary over the years. And my understanding is some of them don't do a very good job of keeping the money, and some of them do an excellent job of keeping the money, and that the league has done better over the years about educating their players to keep the money. So I don't know if he has money or not. If it's an intentional, if he murdered her, there's no insurance, right? There's no insurance that would cover that. There's nobody else. I don't really see any path to having a lawsuit against the league or a lawsuit against the team. You would sometimes consider that if you had a violent act committed by a current player, but he's a retired player. So they're going to put a high tag on it, and the case will be frozen for the most part while the criminal case plays out, because he doesn't have to testify in the civil case while he has criminal charges pending against him. He has a Fifth Amendment right. And usually what happens is the civil cases wait. They get filed and they just wait until the criminal case is done. So there's a lot of questions there. The first one being, what kind of money is he actually worth? And then you can kind of figure out what would that settlement negotiation look like.
And then just lastly, I mean, I remember when Darron Lee was a player in college, very brief stint in the pros. And it's just, in some of these cases, it's not the first time that we've seen a player who seemed to have the entire world in the palm of their hand, the opportunity to not have to worry about money ever again. And then they're accused in these horrific crimes. Just what stands out to you in cases like this? Just kind of the humanity of it all, that someone loses their life, but then you have a defendant that typically doesn't fit the profile of what we typically see in murder cases, of someone who comes from money, someone who has all this opportunity and seems allegedly to have thrown it all away.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we have plenty of murder cases where there are defendants who you can't understand why they would put themselves in their position. Alec Murdaugh, right? That's a big murder case. That guy's not a football player, but he was a very wealthy, successful lawyer. He's accused of killing his wife and son. Nick Reiner, I understand there may be mental illness issues there, but that's someone who seemingly would have had every opportunity. So this plays out over and over and over again. And I know we see a lot of violence out of football players. And I don't know, because I've never sat down to do the math as to whether that's statistically disproportionate or we're just highlighting those cases because they're famous cases. But the bottom line is, murder and other crimes are committed often by people you cannot understand why they would do that. And if Darron Lee did what he's accused of doing, I don't understand how any person under any circumstances could have done that. It's beyond comprehension, and it's a question for a jury.
And we'll see how it plays out. Another case I think of course, Aaron Hernandez, and how that played out, in the NFL as well. Just a very, very sad case. This woman, 29 years old, losing her life. Darron Lee being held without bond. We'll see what happens next. Rich Schoenstein, trial attorney. Always great to have you on Law and Crime. Thanks for being here.
Glad to be here. Take care.
That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law and Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify, and we're also now streaming on Peacock. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.